The sermon, come back next week. If you're a visitor and you love the sermon, come back next week. Okay. What's that? I can't do anything with you regulars. I've been trying to do something with you regulars for years. No, I'm kidding. I told my wife when I got done with the baptism, I said, I think I was more nervous about baptizing Kim than I was actually getting up here and preaching, because I don't get to baptizing too many people, and it's a whole different ball game. But it reminds me of a story, and I might have done this when I was younger, if not for a little bit of grace and living in a small town. There was a young, inexperienced pastor who was asked to do a sermon for a man who didn't have any family, didn't have any friends, and he was going to be buried in a pauper cemetery. And the young man had directions to the cemetery, but he got turned around and he got lost. And after a few missed turns and getting turned around, he finally made it to the spot. And when he got there, he noticed that all the people were gone. The backhoe was sitting next to the hole, but they'd already lowered the coffin and everything else. And he felt really, really bad that he hadn't been there when they did that. And so he walked up to the hole, and he stood over the hole, and he gave what was the most impassioned and just heartfelt sermon that he could give. And when he walked away, he noticed that there were workmen sitting underneath the tree, and he thought maybe they were just resting after digging this hole. And he overheard one of them say, "I've been putting in septic tanks for 20 years, and that's the first time I've ever seen that." So I hope when I get done, I don't give you a pitch on how to buy a septic tank or anything like that. I hope you actually hear a sermon this morning. We're going to continue in our series about social media and how it's made us more self-centered and more detached from the rest of the world. And one of the things that we're going to talk about this morning is how we tend to lose our sense of compassion when it comes to social media. Now, I don't want anybody to be offended by this, but you'll probably be offended by something I say today, and that's okay. I've learned over the years that I have a tendency to say things that offend people, not because I do it on purpose, but because I just sometimes feel like I have to say whatever it is that God's laid on my heart. After many years of just saying, well, that's what God is telling me to say, I've learned to put a filter on that and figure out, is it really what God wants me to say, or is it how I say it? But when I talk about being compassionate, it's probably going to offend several of you, because I'm betting that you're sitting in this room thinking that you're a very compassionate person, that you are concerned about things that go on in other people's lives, and I may challenge you to think differently about that. And that's the entire purpose of this series, is to get you to think more about how you interact with the people that you are now connected with when it comes to social media. But I want to give you an example of something that happened last year. It was kind of a phenomenon, and I know some of you even participated in it, and so this is where you'll get offended if you did. How many of you remember last year the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge that went around social media? Okay, a few of you do. So there was this big movement that people would dump ice cold water on their heads and challenge other people to do the same thing to try to raise money for ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. And it went all over the place. I mean, celebrities were doing it. Just normal, average, everyday people were doing it. And we thought that this might be the way that we were going to finally get everybody to understand that ALS was a disease that needed to be conquered, and we were going to get people to really get excited and motivated to give and knock it out. And here we are a year later, and how many of you today are still challenging people to do the Ice Bucket Challenge? Nobody. When's the last time you saw a video on your Facebook feed or Twitter or YouTube of somebody doing the Ice Bucket Challenge? It's kind of gone by the wayside. And that tends to be what happens with compassionate causes that pop up on social media. Everybody gets really, really excited when it first comes up, and it gets shared a little bit and shared a little bit, but the longer it goes, the less people care about it. Does that mean you're not a compassionate person? Does that mean that you don't care about what's going on? Absolutely not. It's just the way things seem to work today in social media. And there was a study done from 1979 to 2009. The University of Michigan did a study of college students and basically asked them a couple of questions that tried to challenge them to think about how they feel when other people are hurt or when other people have something bad happen to them. In the course of that 30 years, the answer to the question that these students felt compassion or empathy for people has declined 40% in 30 years. Now again, that doesn't mean that you sitting in this room don't feel compassion for one another when something goes wrong, because I know you do. Okay? I'm not trying to stand up here and tell you all that you have become so completely desensitized to every cause and everything that causes people harm that you don't do anything anymore, because I know you do. Okay? I've seen it firsthand. I know people have seen it firsthand. In fact, we have a pretty good example sitting over here. I'm going to embarrass him for just a minute. Mr. Harry, last week we were praying for John Freeman after church because of some news that he got about his cancer. And Harry was going in Monday for a test to see if his cancer had returned. And so we prayed for him as well. And there were a bunch of people in this group, and we all prayed together. And Harry got a report this week that he is cancer-free. So I know you know how to show compassion because I've seen it. Okay, this is not about the fact that you're desensitized. It's the fact that we all can become desensitized to these things, and we have to watch out for that to happen. Now, there are a few ways that this happens, and social media is maybe one of the primary reasons that this happens. Number one, something bad that happens to somebody else, something painful, becomes a cause that becomes easily abandoned. So you go back to my ALS ice bucket challenge before. It brought a lot of awareness at a certain point last year, and then everybody just said, oh, okay, I'm done. Because somebody would challenge another person who wouldn't accept the challenge. And then the challenge just kind of faded away and died. And then another cause would come up, and everyone would get all excited, and post after post and news updates and all this thing would come across your Facebook page until you got to the point where maybe you just weren't as concerned as everybody thought you should be. And so you kind of start to scroll by it. The other problem is we've used social media to become more obsessed with ourselves. The ALS Ice Bucket Challenge wasn't really about taking a video and showing you getting cold water dumped on your head, but those turned into glorified selfies, right? People would stand outside and say, what a great cause this was. Look at me, I'm getting cold water dumped on my head for a good cause. To me, that's no different than taking a picture of yourself and posting it on social media and say, look at me, don't I look great? Look at my new outfit. This is not new, by the way. I did pull these jeans out of the closet, but they're not new. We do the duck face selfie. Everybody knows what the duck face selfie looks like. I wish I had a picture of my wife doing the duck face selfie, but I don't. I'd put it up on the screen. You pose in front of a mirror. You take a picture with yourself, with your food, with your puppy, with your kitten. We've become obsessed as a people with showing everybody how great our life is. And so when we see things like this, we don't even stop to pay attention. Unless it maybe is a way for us to go, oh, I could get involved, and I could put myself on Facebook and show how how I think this is a great cause, and maybe I'll do something silly and everybody else will like it. And unfortunately, because we've seen so much in a day and age where we're connected and we can see everything that goes on around us, we have become so connected that we've lost compassion. We see it every day on the news. We see people in foreign countries who are going through war and horrible things, and Christians being beheaded across the world, and just I could go on and on and on, and we just scroll through. We change the channel. We flip through our Facebook feed. We ignore those people on Twitter. It's not that we don't care. We just don't care, right? We don't care enough to stop and say, how horrible is that? What can I do to help? We just say, I'm tired of seeing it all the time. I'm going to go on to something else. Oh, look, Chad posted a picture when he went out and got hot wings. I bet those were good. We ignore things because it's easy. Unfortunately, this is not a new problem. This is not pardon me, talk amongst yourselves for a minute. I'm so glad Chad took his red cup off the stage too, because I'd have grabbed the wrong one. This is not a new problem. We can't blame Facebook. We can't blame Mark Zuckerberg as much as we would like to. This has been going on for ages. And in fact, Jesus talked about this very same problem in the book of Luke. And we're going to look at that in just a minute. But I want you to know something very interesting. I'm not a big Greek philosopher. I once told the church that my knowledge, my understanding of Greek was comparable to me saying that my wife liked to go to McDonald's on our anniversary for dinner, okay? I know enough, and I read enough, and I kind of get some stuff. But this one was kind of interesting. The word compassion, as it's used in the Greek language, is a word that means to feel something, brace yourselves, feel something as if it's in your bowels. Compassion is something that comes from the stomach or the gut, and it just twists or whatever. It's a feeling. It's not just, oh, I'm going to show compassion by taking a picture, or I'm going to show compassion by giving $1, or I'm going to show compassion by buying some cookies from the Girl Scouts because they're outside at Walmart and it's really windy and cold, and they look cute in their little outfits, and they just need me to buy one box of cookies, and then they'll be all warm and snuggly, and everything will be fine. I'm not picking on any of these people, by the way. I'm just using examples. There were a lot of people in the early church that thought that love that Jesus gave and compassion actually was a physical response to what he did for them. And I don't know if you've ever had a situation where you've really had to lay out some serious compassion for somebody and understood what it meant to really hurt for them. But that's what this word kind of symbolizes or means. And so Jesus tells this story. He has a man in Luke chapter 10. You can turn over there if you want to. I'm going to be in chapter 10, verses 25 through 37. But Jesus is approached by a man who's an expert in the law, and he asks him what the greatest commandment is. And Jesus tells him there are two. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Those are pretty simple commandments, right? We can understand what it means to love God and love your neighbor. And so the man, thinking he was going to get one over on Jesus or maybe confuse Jesus, asked him one more question. He said, "Who is my neighbor?" And so Jesus proceeds to tell him this story. I'm going to start reading in verse 30. It says, in reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. And I'm going to stop right there because the last question is kind of the important question that we're going to kind of wrap this all up with. So we have a story of a man who's going from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he's assaulted by robbers. They beat him and take everything that he has, and they leave him for dead on the side of the road. We think, wow, that even happened way back then? Sure did. People had all kinds of problems. They're not new problems for us. They're just the same problems. They change. Instead of getting beaten, now people get shot for their stuff, right? It's all the same thing. And so Jesus says that this man is laying there half dead, and a priest walks by. Now, a priest would have been on his way, more than likely. Commentators and scholars think that he was probably on his way to the temple to actually perform his priestly duties. And if he saw this man who looked like he should have been dead, and probably for all intents and purposes looked like he was completely dead, if the priest were to come over and try to help him and he was dead, he would have been unclean and unable to serve in the temple. And so Jesus uses him as an example of someone who has religious, Christian things to do that at that moment are more important than stopping to help. Now, he's not saying that we should not go to church because there are people out in the world that have needs. He's not saying that. What he's saying is that this man passed him by on the other side. He didn't even stop to check on him at all. He just went about his business. The next man to come along was a Levite. And the Levite would have been kind of a priest in training. He would have been from the line of Levi, who were the priests. They were set aside by God in the Old Testament to be the priests. And so you had to be from the tribe of Levi to even be considered a priest. So a Levite would have been someone who was in line to be a priest, but he wasn't there yet. No reason he couldn't stop and help the guy, right? He wasn't going anywhere to do anything important, as far as the story tells us. He might have thought he was on his way to do something important, but he doesn't stop. In fact, it says he goes and passes the man on the other side. Now, if we modernize this story just a little bit, it might look something like this. There was a man who was walking down the streets of downtown when he stopped at a shop to look in the window. 2 men jumped him from behind. They took all of his clothes. They beat him to death and left him laying on the sidewalk. And then a young man on his way to whatever it was he had to do stopped inside the window and thought that his new outfit looked so nice that he should take a selfie. So he took out his camera and he pointed it at the window and he did his little manly duck face pose, whatever that is. I don't know what that is. I don't do those. Took his picture, posted it on Facebook, and what nobody notices is that the man who's been beaten is laying in the reflection in the picture. The man puts his camera phone away, he walks off, and he goes about his business. The next man walks up, catches a glimpse of himself in the mirror, and says, "Man, my new haircut looks awesome." Stops, takes a picture, does his little pose, clicks the picture, posts it on Facebook. Nobody notices that there's a half-dead man laying on the floor. And then we have the Samaritan. And if you know anything about biblical history or the time period that Jesus is talking about, the Samaritans were the worst of the worst when it came to the Jews. They were half-breeds, they were outcasts, they were people to be avoided and shunned at all costs. To the point that if you were traveling and had to go through Samaria, you actually made time in your travel schedule to go around Samaria so that the dirt of the ground didn't infect your feet. And Jesus says that a Samaritan stopped in this story and took care of the man. Now, it doesn't say that he stopped and looked at him and said, "Are you okay?" Do you need some help? Do you need me to call somebody? It says he took out some oil and put it on his wounds. He bandaged the man's wounds. He picked the guy up off the ground, put him on his own donkey, and carried him to an inn, where apparently he stayed with him overnight, because it says the next day he gets up and goes to the innkeeper and gives him 2 coins, which would represent 2 full days of wages, to cover the expense of keeping the man there. And that when the Samaritan would return from his travels, he would make sure that he stopped at the inn and covered any additional expenses that there would be involved in taking care of this man. So in our modern day story, it would have been a man who sees a half-dead man. He runs to his car and gets out his first aid kit that he always keeps in the car for emergencies, and he bandages the wounds that he can, and he takes him to the local hospital. In this case, he would have had to drive to South Haven, probably to the hospital. And he gets up to the nurse's station and says, this man's been beaten, he's been robbed, he doesn't have any identification, he doesn't have anything on him, but here's $200 to get him in the door. Take care of him, and apparently we'll sit and make sure the man gets his attention. And then when it's time for him to go, he goes to the hospital and says, please take care of this man, do whatever it takes, and when I come back through town, I will pay whatever he owes. Now, I'm not asking for hands on this question. How many of you would go to that level of compassion for somebody? And I'm not just talking about somebody that you know, or a family member, or a close friend. I'm talking about a complete stranger on the side of the road that you don't know from Adam. And I don't know who Adam is, but everybody says we don't know him from Adam, so Adam's apparently pretty famous. That you do not know. You have never met, you've never talked to, you've never tweeted, you've never Facebook messaged, you've never shown an Instagram photo of, nothing. You don't know this guy from anybody. How many of you would actually stop and go to that kind of trouble for somebody? I'll be honest with you, I couldn't do it. Not for somebody I didn't know. And so Jesus answers the expert's question with a question, as he was so often loved to do many times. And he looked at the man and he said, so you tell me, in my story, who was the neighbor to the man who was beaten by robbers? And the expert in the law had to admit, he doesn't say it was the Samaritan. He says it's the one who had pity on him. And Jesus tells him to go and do likewise. What is he telling him to do? He is telling him to go and find people who are in need and go to whatever level of sacrifice and extreme you need to go to meet their needs. If you truly want to know what it means to love your neighbor as yourself, this is the extreme you would go to. Now, if I were put in that position, I don't think I would have liked the answer that Jesus gave me to that question. I really don't think I would. Because that means my neighbor is everybody that I come into contact with. That means my neighbor is everybody that is in my circle that I have any kind of remote connection with whatsoever. And that's hard. And I'm not going to stand up here and say it's not hard, because I said earlier, and we don't say it often enough, but doing this, being a true Christ follower, is not easy. Okay, if it were easy, we would have run out of chairs, 45 minutes ago. And there have been people busting the doors down, trying to get in, and then the walls would have been lined with people standing up, sitting on the floor. And it's not. If it were easy, there wouldn't be churches this morning that were having their very last service closing because they didn't have enough people to keep the lights on and the doors open and the pastor paid and everything else. Which, by the way, I've heard this more often times than I'd like to care to admit, and I would never say it to anybody. But you all know that the pastor only works one day a week, and he's overpaid for what he does. I once sat in a church, I will not name names, I once sat in a church that was the opening sentence of every board meeting. Do you know why? Because the pastor's salary was the first item on the budget, and the first thing that you talked about in a board meeting was the budget. If we didn't pay the pastor so much money, we might be able to do something around here. Y'all are missing the point. Okay, enough. I'm soapboxes. I'm done. That's not very compassionate, by the way. I don't know if you've never had that experience. You've never had somebody tell you that you get way overpaid for doing what they essentially think is nothing. It's not a good feeling. Where was I going with this? Compassion. Churches are closing because people are not showing compassion. Churches are going out of business because there's just not enough people that care anymore. And it's sad. Because Jesus says we shouldn't just care enough to dump cold water on our head and take a selfie. We should care enough to go out of our way to do something for somebody else. So the natural question, the natural thing that you want me to tell you this morning, which I can't really do, is how do I be more compassionate, Keith? What do I do to be more compassionate? Well, I could think of 100 things that you'd need to do, but we don't have that kind of time. But I can give you 3, I guess. I don't know. They're not very good, but they're not bad. 3 ways that you can learn how to show more compassion. Number 1, and none of you are going to like this one, but you're going to have to hear it, is put the phone down. Log off Facebook for a little while. Find something that really you feel strongly about and that you think needs to have something done. You can't be compassionate doing this all day long or whatever you do. I use my thumb on my phone, but if you're using a mouse or you're using whatever, you can't be compassionate by looking at 1,000 different causes and trying to figure out which one is yours. You just have to put it down for a while. Sometimes social media is not all it's cracked up to be. Okay? I hate to break that to all of you, but it is not the end-all, be-all. All right, I'm going to tell you one more joke. I probably shouldn't tell this one, but I will. I was at work one day, and I had a few minutes. So I got on, I was on my laptop, and I got on to the Lowe's website, and I was looking at something at Lowe's. And I looked at it for a minute. I didn't look at anything very long, because I'm not supposed to do that while I'm at work, you know. It's supposed to be working. And I picked up my phone, which was not connected to the same network, and I went to Facebook and I logged on for a minute when I was at lunch, and I looked, and it said, Facebook thinks you should like Lowe's and because of these products, which were the exact same products that I had just looked at on my laptop. And I thought, wow. So I've decided that if Google and Facebook and Twitter all decide to merge and change their name to Skynet, it is time to get rid of everything. And for those of you that know what I'm talking about, you understand that joke. If you don't, go home and watch the Terminator movies, and you will understand what I'm talking about, okay? Skynet was the thing that created the Terminators that caused the end of the world. We're too connected sometimes, okay? We're too connected to everything that goes on in the world. Sometimes you just got to put it down and come back home. Because the first thing that you can do after you log off and put that away is you can find a place to serve. Preferably, for me, I would prefer you find a place in your church to serve people. You can show compassion here just as well as you can show it anywhere else. But if that's not enough and you still feel like you need to show more compassion, then go out in the community and find something to do, because you can always help other people. Whether it be offering to buy groceries for somebody that's in front of you at line, or paying for somebody's meal in the drive-thru who's behind you, or any number of things. Those are small, compassionate things that you can do. But find something and serve. Okay, you can't I'm going to say it again. You can't be compassionate if you're just looking at all the things you need to be compassionate about. You have to get out and do something. And last on that little list is probably the hardest one and the one that nobody really wants to hear, but it's really true. True, honest, heartfelt compassion takes time. All right, the Samaritan in the story took days to take care of this man, okay? At least 2 days, and probably more by the time he came back and finished paying for what was going on. It takes time. It takes effort. It takes listening to people who have problems that you can't even imagine exist in this world today. And that will just completely blow your mind and make you go, how does this even happen? It takes effort. I'll say it one more time. You cannot be compassionate if all you do is see everything you need to be compassionate about this far away. Let's pray.